Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Highland and Hardwater Outdoor Podcast. This is Matt and Zach.
Hey, everyone.
We just got off the phone with Danell Lynn. It was a really great conversation. She's a Guinness World Record holder for the longest journey by motorcycle in a single country. It was a really good conversation.
Yeah, in this podcast, Danell goes over some of her childhood camping trips with her family, some of the humanitarian work that she's done. Of course, we discuss her world record trip on a motorcycle. She even goes over a couple riding tips and gear that she likes, as well as some of her writing, fashion, and a few upcoming adventures.
Yeah, it was really great. We hope everybody enjoys it. We have a lot of great guests coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. And also make sure you leave a rating and review on iTunes. So in the meantime, enjoy the podcast, and we'll talk to everybody later. Hey everybody, today we are joined by Danell Lynn. Danell is an adventurer and Guinness World Record globetrotter. She is the first solo woman ever to break the world record for longest journey by motorcycle in a single country. She was one of 12 women to ride in northern Pakistan for a documentary. She is the designer and owner of a custom high fashion line, which has dressed Mrs. World and Miss America. And we want to welcome Danell to the podcast.
Hello.
So how are things going right now? What are you up to?
Oh, things are awesome. Up to many things, and thanks for the great introduction. I am continuing to be an adventure traveler. Life is always filled with art and fashion for me, and writing, and so staying busy, which is a very productive way to live a life.
Awesome. So just to kind of get into more of your history, when you were younger, did you have an interest in travel, or did you travel a lot when you were a kid?
Yeah, I was actually raised in a really awesome family that appreciated travel. So when I was really young, we lived in the U.S. Not when I was really young, but throughout most of my younger childhood, we lived in the U.S. And we started first always adventuring by camping. And it just depended on where we were at financially as a family. So we always made sure to incorporate it. Sometimes it was tent camping. Sometimes it was RV. Sometimes it was hotels. My dad joined the service when I was really young. He was in the Air Force, career Air Force for, I believe, 29 years. Don't quote me on the number because I just forgot it. So you can cut that part out, Matt. That'd be awesome. So don't break my dad's heart. So my dad was career military. And when I was a teenager, we actually moved to Europe, which expanded our horizons for travel as well as camping. But in the U.S., national parks were a big part of how I grew up. So I always grew up hiking, traveling, mini adventures. Anytime we had off school, my parents made an adventure for us, whether it was a road trip or a camping trip. We always ended up going somewhere every year.
Very nice. Did you have any particularly favorite camping trips that you went on?
As a kid, Yellowstone was always one of my favorites. I really loved that park when we went. I was probably 8. And when I revisited it as an adult, it just still was magnificent and as huge as I remember. So it's one of my favorite national parks.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. So did you guys RV through there?
For that one, I believe we had the truck with the camper shell at that time.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And then one of the years when I was in 4th grade, we took 4th or 5th grade when my dad came back from Desert Storm, because he got the combat pay. So he bought a travel trailer that had bunk beds. So I have 2 older brothers. So there's 3 of us. So we're a family of 5.
Oh, cool.
And so he bought a dually and a nice travel trailer with bunk beds. And we went to Alaska for a month.
Nice.
Yeah. So it was a cool way to spend summer.
So any favorite stories from those travels, or anything that you want to get into?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So I'm 38 and I've been traveling pretty much most of my life. So there are more stories than could fill one podcast, probably. Yeah.
So what about in Alaska? Anything particular in Alaska?
Alaska, one of the scariest things when we were there was we were out. We always took our bicycles. And so we were out just for a family bicycle ride.
Cool.
And this family of moose just crossed in front of us, which was very
Wow.
magnificent, but terrifying at the same time, because you don't realize how huge they are till they're about 15 feet from you.
Yeah, definitely.
And, we all stopped. My dad was like, don't move. And the mom turned her head, just took a glance at us, and then they kept walking, So you're like,
Oh my
is she going
goodness.
to charge? Is she going to walk? I don't know. So that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, cool. Because how old would you have been at that time? Probably pretty young, right?
I was young. I was 4th or 5th grade.
Oh, wow. I would imagine that would be a pretty, an experience that would stick with you for a long time.
It definitely did. I can still see her eyes, like her big brown eyes that just looked right over at us. Like, are you going to mess with my kids? Nope, we're good. Okay.
Did you come across any other wildlife? Any bears or anything like that, maybe?
I do remember seeing them. None is close like that, which is probably
good.
beneficial. So, yeah.
And so you grew up, in the outdoors and traveling. And then, so once you got a little bit older, did you start traveling on your own, and kind of what led you into that? Or even into riding, if you want to get into that?
Right. Yeah. So people always ask, like, when did you first ride? And I actually have photographs of my mom pregnant on the back of my dad's bike. So my first ride was in utero.
Nice.
So that's kind of when I first, yeah. And then when we were younger, my dad got into a very bad motorcycle accident. So he got rid of his bikes, actually. And then as we all got older, we picked it back up. So I come from a family of riders. Both my brothers ride. My dad rides. My mom rides pillion. My uncle rides. So I have a lot of riders in my family. So I was surrounded by it for a long time, but we didn't get serious about it till we became adults. And I transitioned into that in my 20s to become a driver because I was tired of riding as a passenger. So I wanted to have control of when I wanted to go on a trip. I could just go and not have to say, hey, can someone ride me around?
So when was your thought to do a long distance trip, and when, sort of what age were you, and then how did you plan for that?
Right. So I began doing bigger type of international travel when I was a teenager. When we moved to Europe, my parents got me really involved in humanitarian work when I was about 12, and that sort of continued throughout my life. I'm still really big into that. And when I was 19, I began to travel solo when I won a competition from university and design school. I won a competition that put my jewelry in the Louvre in Paris.
Oh, cool.
And so I wanted to go back, even though I had been a couple times as a kid. And so that kind of kickstarted my solo travel. And then I just continued to plan and go places, whether I could travel with somebody or whether I was just going alone. And I tended to find out that I loved the doors that opened when I traveled solo, because depending on what parts of the country you go to, there's a different reception. If you're in a group, that you're encompassed in the conversation with your group that you came with, rather than when you're solo and you're just completely exploring your surroundings. And then the locals in the area give a different reception to you as well.
Nice. So how would you plan your trips then? Would you have a specific location or several locations that you wanted to hit, or would you just kind of just go for it and see where the road took you?
Yeah, so I plan my trips pretty much it's anywhere I haven't been is how I decide where to go. That's the basis
that's a good way
of
to do
all
it.
my
Yeah,
planning.
that's an awesome way. Yeah.
I mean,
Anything
there's not-
specific that you would like kind of look for within locations, or like views or anything like that?
Yeah, so it does kind of depend on the trip I'm going on. So in 2008, I opened 2 humanitarian companies.
Oh, nice.
Thanks. Through DL Couture, when I opened that fashion company, I started Threading Hope Project, which is a project that delivers quilts to children and families in need in the developing world.
Very cool.
And then through my fine art company, because I also do figurative oil painting and fine art, I opened Project Highwire, which is about building bridges across countries through art. And so with that, I take backpacks full of art supplies and I do a therapeutic art lesson with children in orphanages or schools. So if I'm planning one of those journeys, that does kind of dictate where I'm going, because I like to go into places where people have worked, because I partner with other humanitarian companies when I go and do these deliveries. So I tend to look for NGOs or nonprofits that people I know have worked for that they've recommended. So I know that those items are going to stay with the kids and they're not going to be taken away when I leave, because that does happen sometimes. So if I'm planning one of those journeys, I'll usually look for not your typical touristy type of place. So I tend to go like to into the back jungles of Colombia or into Haiti after the earthquake. Not places you think of as like a touristy travel place, but I'll usually spend about a week doing that project, and then I'll do like a week or longer as a tourist and just explore the country and see what it has to offer.
Awesome.
Yeah, that is so awesome. When you were telling us about that, it kind of sparked another question. So I know that we talked before we got on the show that we were going to kind of get into a lot of things that you're interested in. So I figured this might be a perfect time to say, okay, so you're into writing, you grew up in the outdoors, and then you mentioned you do fine art and you do all the quilting, and then you do this other work for charities. When you were younger, when did that start? When did the fine art start, or when did the interest in that start?
So I've been writing, not writing, they're very close words.
Writing, yeah.
Since I was in elementary school, I was part of the young authors group that was offered in the schools. So I've been in love with words and crafting stories since I was very young. And then the arts, I come from a very artistic family. My mom's artistic. My dad is artistic. My dad does amazing woodworking. My mom is a great quilter. She's actually a co-founder of Threading Hope with me. Her mother did a lot of art throughout her growing up. Like when I was a child, many of my clothes, especially my nicer clothes for weddings, were always made by my grandmother or my mother. They always made the really nice dresses for us. So I kind of grew up around that. And I'm sure, even though I can't pinpoint exactly when, I'm sure all of that led into my passion for art and design.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you said that when you were a teenager, that was when you were kind of doing some of your travel and your long distance travel. But then did you sort of, like you mentioned earlier, you kind of based your travel on those things as well. So you kind of did them all at the same time.
Yeah, so I think I was 12 when we visited Estonia, and we went there as a family as part of a humanitarian project to build orphanages. And then I was either 13 or 14 when we went to build houses in Kenya in Africa. So even how I grew up kind of incorporated that into the travels we took. But we did a lot of other ones as well that didn't revolve around a project. Like when we lived in England, and you just shoot over to Europe and go to Germany or open the doors. And Europe is so structured in a way that you can visit many places on 1-2 week journey.
Cool. Do you find that your adventures and your humanitarian work kind of bleeds into your design as well? Like, do you get a lot of inspiration from that?
Oh, it definitely does. So I went to fashion school directly out of high school. So I moved from Texas to Miami, Florida for art school. And I started working in the field under a very well-known couture designer out there. At the time, I didn't know I wanted to be a couture designer. I thought I wanted the T-shirt with my name in every store. And then once I found this high fashion, one of a kind, I realized I actually don't want mass marketed products. I want the walking art in one dress at a time that's never remade. And so I worked with them as an understudy and then became an assistant designer for a little while. And it's very much the movie Devil Wears Prada. So I had to make a decision on if that's what I wanted my life to be like. And I decided I wouldn't work in that industry in the way that I was until I owned my own business. So a few years later, I started DL Couture and started running my own. And I based it on humanitarianism, but also all of our fabrics are globally sourced by myself. So I buy them from the person in the country that I'm visiting. So there's
very cool. Very cool.
Yeah. So they receive all of those funds. I don't buy it from a store in the US that marks it up $300 a yard. It goes directly to the people who are making those fabrics. And then the gowns are made from that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So then, you had to prepare for your project of, breaking the record for the longest journey in a single country on a motorcycle. So when did that idea come into your mind? And then if you want to kind of get into how you prepared for that.
Sorry, I was taking a pause to sip my coffee.
That's okay.
I thought your question
problem.
was going to go longer. I was like, ooh, drink time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I decided that I was going to go on the road for a year, I actually didn't know yet where I was going to go. 2 years before I left, I started to save for the trip. And I did that when I was coming back from a trip that I was on to, I did a trip to Peru. And on the train to Machu Picchu, I met 2 Australians that were riding their GSAs from Alaska to Argentina. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And I had already been attending events like Overland Expo. It's where I actually met Corey of Mr. Heater. We became friends there. And then I met all these other adventure riders at Horizons Unlimited and thought, wow, this is pretty cool. You can just have this type of life and people don't think you're crazy, because in a typical platform, like at your week where you live in Phoenix, for example, for myself at the time, and I would speak about these ideas of hitting the road for a year and traveling to all 50 states and going to provinces in Canada, and people are like, you're nuts. That's the weirdest thing I ever heard. But in Overland Expo and Horizons Unlimited, you have those conversations and people are like, oh yeah, that's awesome. You should meet so-and-so. They've done something similar. So part of that inspiration came from just putting myself around other people that had similar ideas so that I didn't feel like it was so crazy. And then when I was on that trip to Peru and I met the 2 individuals from Australia, it sparked my interest to say, okay, I'm going to do this. So on my flight home, I actually made the decision that I was going to go somewhere for a year on my motorcycle solo, but I just didn't know where yet.
Got it. Okay. So then when did you decide where you're going to go?
Yeah, it was probably about a year out. I decided I wanted to do all 50 states and into Canada because
that's awesome.
I grew up, as we were talking about, traveling through parts of the U.S. and going to national parks, and there's a lot just in our backyards. And I do a lot of international travel as well, but I wanted to showcase what we had to offer here in my home country. So that's how I kind of made the decision to do 1 year, all 50 states in Canada. And then from there, as I started planning that trip and looking into it, I thought, oh, I used to like to read that book when I was a kid, the Guinness World Records. I wonder if this could be something.
Yeah.
So I applied to be the first woman on a Triumph to ride to all 50 states in Canada, which is like a crazy long sentence. And they said, no, we're not going to make that a record.
Okay.
Like, oh, okay. But they said, you can break this one that already exists. And I said, oh, okay. And they said, it's not a gender specific, so you'll be going against women and men. And I was like, sweet, sounds perfect. So I decided I'd set out to try to double the current record that was in place at that time. And I almost doubled it, but I did break the record. And I was the first woman to break that.
That's awesome.
Solo.
Yeah, I mean, because there's a lot of stories that I read about people that even do transcontinental walks or transcontinental trips on their bicycle or even on their motorcycle. And the reason a lot of them do it is to see things from land that they've never seen before. Like you see parts of the country that you would never see, and you may even see them at a slower speed than if you drove it in a car. You just would see so much more of the country if you did it that way.
Yeah, you do see a lot more on a motorcycle than in a car, just simply because of the roof and doors. I mean, it's just by nature, you're more open to what you're riding in. And those that are doing the bicycle riding, they get even more than what I would get as a motorcyclist, because their pace is slower by nature because you're self-powered. So they're stopping and experiencing more as they go, and they're completely open. You typically don't see the bicyclists in a full helmet and riding suit. So they're more exposed to the elements as well.
So along those lines, were there any particular areas of the country or specific memories that you have that stand out to you?
Yeah, it's really funny because the U.S. is so diverse, and I think I did a lot of travel through it. I had been to all 50 states by the time I was 19. So coming back and doing it in my 30s was a totally new perspective of it. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to view it from an adult perspective, but also see these amazing sites that were so huge to me when I was a child. And many of them still are very large, but not as big as I remember them when I was, 7 years old and kind of tiny tyke, But I really enjoyed riding through Alaska. That was a lot of fun for me. It rained the whole time. It wasn't the best weather, but I loved riding through Alaska and Canada and breaking my own goals and perceived barriers. I was told I could never make it on the Dalton with a Triumph Bonneville, and I tried to order my knobby tires. They didn't come in on time. I only had the day when I was there, so I rode it on street tires, and everyone thought I was crazy. And, it's fantastic to then make it to the Arctic Circle and be like, we did it. Yay. Okay, now let's go back and continue the trip. So things like that are a lot of fun. In doing a solo trip, whether it's on a motorcycle or you're just traveling to a country you've never been to, you're always putting yourself in a position where you're going to have challenges. And I think that's something that also excites me about solo travel, because I love not living in this box of comfort and always finding more things that I'm capable of than I thought I could do. Like there were times where my bike stopped working and I couldn't figure out what it was doing. And what happened was it had flooded from the rain into a filter because I bought a used bike and a guy had changed up the filter system. And so it got wet when I was in a big rainstorm. And, you're sitting on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. Your cell phone's not working because you're in the mountains. And you just feel like nothing can work out. You feel that's it. The trip is over. I've failed. And then you take 5 minutes to process it. And you're like, okay, well, I have no one else to depend on. So I've got to pull myself together and figure out what to do in this situation, So I think that that's fantastic life lessons that you get when you're solo, because you can't look at the partner you're traveling with and say, okay, so what should we do? Let's figure it out together. You only have your internal dialogue. So I think that's kind of something that isn't necessarily state specific, but travel specific.
Yeah, I imagine you would have had to come across a lot of unplanned hurdles that you had to get through. Would you say those were some of the biggest ones that you had to get through?
Yeah, I didn't actually have any huge ones like other individuals when they go on some trips, and everyone's always like, what was the worst experience? I'm like, I don't have one. Like everything that was kind of could be looked at as a bad experience. Like when I blew out my rear tire traveling in California, I thought, okay, that could have gone really bad. I've never had like that before. Upright, it didn't crash, all was good. And so I just sat on the side of the road. And because I was in the US, I have AMA insurance. And so I just started to make my dinner and wait for my tow truck. So it was a really simple thing. I didn't need to flip the bike and try to change the tire because I knew I was close enough to a city. So I think that things can go really bad. Luckily, they didn't for me. I had a really amazing trip. I did go down once and kind of call it a crash only because it shattered my windshield.
Oh,
wow.
But it wasn't really a crash because it was only like 3 miles an hour. So what was happening is I was in Florida and decided a friend of mine had come down. He had just picked up a new BMW in New York. We met and went to the Barber's Museum in Alabama. I think it's in Alabama. So I was traveling up from Florida and went to that. We visited that together, and then he was like, I got to get back to Washington really fast. So he was taking this long trip back with his bike in the weather, and I thought, well, if he's riding that long in 2 days, in 4 days, I could probably ride home for Christmas. So I made the decision to ride home for Christmas, and because I was doing a Guinness World Record, I had a spot tracker on my bike that I couldn't access like GPS on. I had no GPS. I didn't even have a smartphone for this trip. But my spot tracker was live, so my dad was watching me come through all these states. And he told my mom, if she hits this state, I'm going to go meet her in New Mexico because she's coming home for Christmas. I know what she's doing. So it's impossible to surprise your parents when you've got a tracker attached to your bike.
Right.
But, so I was watching the weather report because I was coming through in winter in New Mexico, and it said, don't go south. There's a big snowstorm. Go north. Go through this road. And I was like, okay. So I took the northern road, which was not snowing, but I hit about 2 miles of sheet ice.
Oh, wow.
And and I had been going on it for like a mile, and it was fantastic. And I was, staying upright, and I thought, oh, this is great. And on this journey, a big part of this journey for me was to help inspire other travelers. And so I was making YouTube videos. So I wanted to pause to film this amazing riding on ice. So I pulled over, stopped really safely, put my GoPro on, got back onto the road, barely put it into gear, and slipped on the ice and slammed down and shattered my windshield.
Wow. Yeah.
So the whole idea was to like record this amazing ice riding skills, and I recorded my crash like 2 seconds after I turned the camera on. So it just, but I was picking up my windshield pieces because this was also a windshield. My dad, mom, and I did a Four Corners trip, and my father, in true father fashion, bought me this big windshield for my bike to go on this trip together, which now is a keepsake on my wall in my garage.
Cool.
But I refused to throw away this windshield that had sentimental value, even though it's shattered completely down from the top to the bottom. So here I am in the middle of the road in full motorcycle gear, like picking up these broken pieces. And a trucker stops, and he was like, you okay? I was like, I'm fine. We're going really slow. There's no injuries, just the windshield looks like there is. And then I get back on the bike because I needed to continue. But the trucker tells me, And this is what I mean when I say the things that could be seen as bad can also be a blessing, because he said, you're so lucky because right around this blind corner, you were about to hit a downhill that's completely covered in ice.
Wow.
And there's no guardrails. So I would have been up at speeds of 30 to 45 on sheet ice. And if I had to stop, I would have slid off the road. Yeah. So who knows what could have occurred there. But I feel like that 3 mile an hour crash, I'll take that over what could have happened if I didn't go down. Fast forward 15 minutes later to the first time that I've ever had like a crash like this and broken something on my bike. And so I get down the hill, I'm at the gas station, pulling myself together. I'm just like, okay, well, that sucked. I'm getting out my Gorilla Tape to tape my windshield together so it can hold on for a little bit. And I've got 15 missed messages. And I'm not the biggest cell phone person. So for me, I was like, oh my God, something serious happened in my family to have 15 missed messages. So I call my mom right away and she's like, your dad is following your spot tracker. He's on the way to meet you. And I kind of had a mild moment of freak out. And I said, no, Mom, I am on sheet ice. If he's following me on his bike,
right.
My dad has had a hip replacement. So I went for worst case scenario. I'm like, if he goes down on that, he can't be following me. We maybe had a 1-minute conversation when I hear a bike coming from the south. So not the same road that I was just on. I peek around the gas station and it's my father.
Wow.
And I'm like, hey, Dad. And he pulls up and I said, Dad, before you get off your bike, know that I went down. The bike looks like I had a really bad accident, but I didn't. And then we sat there and laughed about it. And he helped me duct tape my windshield back together. And then we rode home to Arizona for Christmas.
Nice. Wow. So for that Christmas, did you get a new windshield as a gift?
Oh, my gosh. So I was only home for like 4 days. And my dad said, you need to order a new windshield, Danell. And I said, no, Dad, I'm going to fix this one. And my dad was in aircraft maintenance throughout his career in the Air Force. So he could have helped me fix this, but he refused. He was like, no, you cannot fix this, Danell. It's too shattered. I said, Dad, I want to keep this shield. So I'm drilling holes. I'm stitching it with metal wire. And about halfway into my drilling, he's like, oh, wow, it's going to work. And I was like, yeah, Dad, it is. And so then he started to help me. And so I finished out the rest of my year with a stitched together windshield that's covered in stickers. And I still have it today.
That is really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love my broken windshield.
This podcast is presented by Mr. Heater, North America's most popular brand of portable heaters and accessories. Use coupon code podcast20 to receive 20% off and free shipping at www.mrheater.com.
So we kind of talked about how you didn't have a GPS on you, and you mentioned that. And so was there a lot of pre-planning? I hate to go back, but was there a lot of pre-planning for the trip, like knowing what destinations you wanted to go to, or did you kind of go that city by city, state by state?
Yeah, so I did use a map. So I used a Rand McNally map, and they're pretty great because they show like the national parks too, and they show different campsites. Little tents are on their maps. But if I didn't have a school visit or a news show or a speaking engagement, I was able to have really loose plans. So I could just open my map and say, okay, which direction do I want to go to?
Got it.
Or if you look at my tracks, you'll see that through the winter, I stayed south and went back and forth a lot in the south because every time I tried to go north, there was a nor'easter or ice storm. So sometimes weather really dictated the path that I took.
And were you camping during this, or were you stopping at hotels on the way?
Yeah, I camped in every state, and I saw friends and family that I hadn't seen in years, so I did some homestays. And then I would get hotels occasionally, like when I was out running an ice storm in Texas, I made it about 20 minutes before it hit to the hotel that I had to stay at for 3 days because the ice storm was so bad.
And then did you also kind of have an idea of time too for the record? Like did that push you as well?
So the only time limit I established for myself. So the record doesn't actually have a time limit.
Got it. Okay.
I did a year because that's what I saved the money for. Okay. So if I would have had enough to stay on the road for 2 years, I could have stayed on the road for 2 years, and had this astronomical record maybe. But the record is also only for the contiguous 48 states, because once I crossed into Canada, they don't count those. But my personal goal was to hit all 50 states. So I still wanted to do Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii, even though those miles don't count towards the record.
Okay.
Nice. How did you do the Hawaii part?
So Hawaii, the idea in the original planning was I was going to ship Amelia, which is my Triumph Bonneville, to Hawaii so that I stayed riding the exact same bike in every state.
Right.
And I got a really awesome opportunity to be the female rider for a Cambodian documentary for A Ride of My Life during my trip. And I asked Guinness if I could go, and they said as long as the bikes didn't stay put for longer than 14 days. So I literally flew to Cambodia, flew back, got off the plane, and got on my bike and moved because I was pushing my 14-day limit because they do have structured limits like that.
Yeah.
But because the bike didn't leave, they allowed me to go on that one. And so the funds that were meant to pay for the bike going to Hawaii, I chose to use on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be one of the dirt bikers for Cambodia. So I ended up actually renting same type of bike, a Triumph Bonneville. It was a limited edition, and so I did a rental Triumph Bonneville for Hawaii.
Got it.
Very nice.
And then so you mentioned that you camped in all states too. How did you do food or any gear? Like, did you stop at markets or stores on the way to cook your lunch and dinner, or did you bring that stuff with you, or did you stop every single time?
Yes, to many of those.
Okay, got it.
I am a foodie. I knew I didn't want to go on a year-long trip and just buy the bagged, freeze-dried type of foods that are full of salt. But I also come from a really great family of dehydrators. So my grandmother had a lot of fun experimenting with different dehydration techniques, and she made a lot of food for me, and she would mail me boxes. So one of my panniers on the motorcycle was completely for my cooking. So I had just a Jetboil, and I had a Jetboil, the cup, the main Jetboil cup, and then a pan. And that's what I did all my cooking in. And then I would stop at local markets as I traveled. If I was near a farmer's market, that was my preference so that I could get stuff fresh. But I'm also a vegetarian, so I didn't need to worry about buying meats when I was on the road or things going bad like that. But so I cooked most of my food. I did, when I was in unique places with foods like I hadn't eaten, I would try the local stuff, like the different type of grits in Louisiana and how they change when you're in Florida and fun stuff like that. So, and I did start to enjoy back east, actually through Ohio and stuff too, where you guys are at. Yeah. I love the diners because they're like true old school diners. So I started doing breakfast more at the diners.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that trip is just so incredible. And so when you got back, when you completed your trip, how did that feel? What an amazing accomplishment.
Yeah, it felt really good. And when I first came back, I came back to my parents' house because I had put everything in storage and sold anything that I didn't need. So I had like a 10x7 storage unit full of my lifetime of accumulated stuff. I couldn't go as far as like down to one box because I've been a traveler my whole life and I do have stuff from my travels and I just can't do it. I can't get rid of everything. But I came back to my parents' house and my family was there to celebrate my return. It was really cool. My mom made a sign about breaking the record and, we ate. I mean, they had a lot of my favorite meals that were so hard to make on the road. So we ate lots of food and it was just luxurious to sleep in and not have to roll up a tent and pack up camp. And, if I wanted coffee, I could just walk out of the guest room in my PJs and press the button. And it was really nice for a while. I was like, wow, this is great. But the reintegration was difficult, but not to a point. So when I was on my trip, I was approached by two guys for Expedition Electric, which was a journey that was going to take custom-made electric bikes from Alaska to Argentina. They put out applications for a female rider. They selected me to be a part of that project. And these weren't mass-marketed bikes, so they weren't in production. They were custom-built attempts at an adventure bike, which at that time, those didn't exist. There have since been some that have come to market now. But it wasn't my trip, so I wasn't the lead of it. So a lot of that, I was just kind of in limbo waiting. So I picked up some part-time work that wouldn't affect, like I wouldn't take on any clients for my work because if I had to leave, I needed to be able to walk away and it not affect what I was doing.
Yeah.
So picked up some things to keep me busy, took a couple classes online through Coursera because I love learning. So I was like, okay, let me learn about this, moralities of life through Yale. Let's do it. So just weird things like that. And then the expedition finally took off. So I went up to Alaska, and the bikes were hard. And we all had a great adventure trying to start to do something that hadn't existed before. But we made it from Alaska into Canada. And then that expedition actually had to go on pause, which has since been like 3 years. So it has stopped due to some of the technical parts of the bike that needed to be corrected. So
Got it.
Had you
it
ridden,
wasn't.
Had you ridden electric bikes before that, or was that your first time?
No, I had not. That was my first time. And that was
Gotcha.
also the heaviest bike I'd ever ridden because it was built on a KTM 990. And then the panniers of the batteries were 250 pounds each.
Oh, wow.
And
Wow.
I don't take passengers on my bike. It's a liability that I just don't feel comfortable with. Like, I'm fine riding myself around if I fall off a cliff, but I don't want to, that's too much anxiety to take a person with me.
Yep.
But, so it was the heaviest bike I'd ever been on. But it was a great group, and we had a support vehicle that we slept in, and we had a lot of fun, and it was a great adventure. And when you're trying to be a pioneer and do something that's never been done, you're going to have times where things fail, and there's going to be stressful situations. And especially when you put a group together that doesn't really know each other. Like, I hadn't met them before. I met them at Overland Expo, and I didn't know them. And I was one female living in an RV with 4 men,
Yeah.
So there were times where we were like, can you just clean the toilet, please? It's gross. I can't handle it. So there's those funny things that go on, but you had great experiences too. And they were a fun group, and I'm glad I did it. I definitely don't regret it at all. And it led me into different lines for electric bikes and different projects that possibly may come up. One of which I was hoping to be able to talk with you guys today, but I don't have confirmation on it. But I'm definitely looking into that a little more and looking into different projects and more globally about where electric bikes can take us in the future.
Cool. Yeah, we could definitely have a conversation about that another time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've been on all these adventures. You broke the Guinness Book of World Records. If someone else was to go out and just do a long distance ride, do you have any tips or advice you would give them?
Yes. And I do have a blog that's full of a lot of that as well, and
cool.
the videos. But I think the first thing to do is, number one, if you've never traveled solo at all, don't just kick it off and say, oh, I'm going to take my bike and go solo for a year. Because there is a mindset you have to get into. You have to know that you're okay being with just yourself and your thoughts for long periods of time. And if you're not, then maybe you build that into your trip and okay, I don't really like to sit and just read for hours. Let me build in these social activities. So for each person, it's going to be about learning who you are and who you are when you travel long distance, and then planning your route or trip around that. And a lot of people will do these long trips and have a space in every state where they stop and meet people, or they'll do couch surfing and meet strangers and talk about their trip constantly. And you just have to know yourself. For me, at events, or because I do national speaking engagements as well, so I seem like very much an extrovert, but I'm by nature an introvert, so I need that space to myself. So couch surfing for me every night and talking about my trip every night to someone new would be emotionally draining. So you have to know yourself and the type of travel you want to do, whereas other people may get energy from that. For me, that's draining if it's an everyday type of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Any specific gear or anything along those lines?
Yeah. So one of the main things I like to tell people is first decide that you want to take the trip, and then give yourself a date. Because if you don't give yourself a date, you will not go.
Got it.
So when I was saving for my trip, the budget I wanted to save, I didn't quite reach. But I reached my deadline of departure day, so I had to go. Because if I just stayed and kept waiting, it would be push and push and push, and then something's inevitably going to happen and you'll have to spend on this bill, or maybe you don't go. So giving yourself a date and telling people about it so they hold you accountable a little bit helps you to make sure that you go on this adventure. And gear-wise, don't always wait for the perfect bike or the perfect gear. Find the bike that works for you. Like, I was told by many people that I could not take a city bike like a Triumph Bonneville on such a grand adventure. But it's the bike I wanted to take, and it fit me well. And the day I went and saw it, I bought it used off of Craigslist. I went to the guy's house, I wrote it and gave him the money that day. I was like, that's it. This is my bike.
Nice.
So then I started to prep it, and my trip was not fiscally sponsored. So I saved and paid for my entire journey, and I had gear and bags and a seat that could have done the trip. But I was very blessed in that I did have gear sponsors come to the table and provide me. Revit gave me a really great riding adventure suit that kept me safer than the cheap one I would have ridden in. Great. Giant Loop provided all of my bags for the bike, which gave me ease of use that I probably wouldn't have had with the cheap bags that I just would have used because I had them. So none of the products I was given would have stopped me from taking the trip if I didn't have them. Because I know some people will say, well, you were sponsored, that's how you could go. And it's like, no, fiscally I wasn't. I was given product, yes, but I already had that, just not that type of quality. So it made a big difference in the enjoyment of my trip for sure. And British Customs provided me a gel seat because the factory Bonneville seat is not the most comfortable. So I had an aftermarket gel seat that they gave me that really helped. I wore moto skivvies, which are a padded type of underwear. And at the time, moto skivvies didn't have the women's underwear, so they gave me the men's. And then I helped chat with them about different ideas about what would be better for women. And I don't know if they took some of my ideas or not, but it was cool to be part of the process. And now they have the women's line out. So those are really nice. And those are scientifically engineered based on your seat bones and your type of bike. So if you're going to ride a crotch rocket, you buy the ones that work for that. If you're riding a street bike, you buy what works for that. If you're riding a dirt bike, so the pads are situated in a place based on the type of bike and your body.
Yeah.
Cool.
And those really helped. I mean, I would do pretty long days on the gel seat and with the moto skivvies, and I'd just get off and be able to walk. I didn't have the tight stiffness that you may have if you don't have that type of gear.
Yeah. So is there any gear where you would recommend people go, like maybe top of the line, like it's important to have a very good quality in this type of gear, and some other stuff that they could maybe just go middle of the line, or maybe used gear or something like that?
Yeah, you can definitely. I mean, truly any type of adventure can be done with whatever you have. It's just a matter of comfort as you're traveling. I mean, if you look at Nathan Millward, who rode from he did Australia back to London on a postie bike, which is pretty much a scooter.
Wow.
And he just rode in like jeans and Converse and a shirt because that's what he had, So I personally would have been really cold in the rainstorms I was in, but I had a really great rain suit. And if you can put that as part of your gear, that would be one of the top things I'd recommend is a rain suit. I really enjoyed the full piece because then I didn't have any seepage anywhere. And I stayed totally dry, and I could also add it over my riding gear in high winds and cold weather, and it blocked out a lot of that and kept me warmer.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Because when you're riding Four Seasons, people always say, well, why'd you ride in the winter? And I'm like, well, because I was on the road for a year. And they're like, yeah, but why'd you ride in the winter? I'm like, because I was on the road for a year.
Yep.
You can't avoid it. It happens. So I think being prepared for stuff like that definitely helps, and giving yourself a little bit of a break to say, if the weather is really bad, it's okay not to camp this day. You don't have to, you don't have to earn your badge and your cred to say, oh, well, I made it through this horrible storm, because you're inevitably going to accidentally have to make it through a horrible storm that you weren't planning on. So don't put yourself in that position when you don't have to.
So we were actually doing some research too, and saw that you have written a number of books. And I know you mentioned earlier in the discussion that you did get into writing when you were younger. So was writing always like part of this journey as well? Writing blog posts, or did you write every day when you were on your journey too?
In my notebooks, I wish I could say I did better and wrote every day. There were months where I wrote every day in my notebooks because I journal. And then there were days where I was so exhausted by the time the day finished, it was all I could do to set up camp and go to sleep. Yeah. And those are the days where I'm like, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have pushed so hard, so I could have had that time. Because looking back, because as I'm working on the book right now on the journey, there are just gaps where I'm like, man, I really wish I wrote something that week.
Yeah.
But I also added some of the times that weren't in my journal were on my blog. So I did start a blog when I was on my trip. I wasn't hugely social media before that, but I wanted to document my trip as I rode and help inspire other people to chase these types of adventures, or just dreams of adventure in whatever direction it took them. And so I did have the blog going. It's still an active blog. I'm adding to it slowly, but it'll become more active again in a few months.
Cool.
But I also write for some other blogs for Ride Now. I write for their motorcycle adventure travel. I write for magazines like Outdoor by 4. I do a couple articles with them each year. So most of the press that I received on my trip, I wrote the press releases for, and I wrote the stories to send in for. So also knowing what you want your trip to become is important when you leave. So if you don't care about the press, if you don't care about building a speaking career after, or being able to go into schools and inspire kids, then those are things you don't need to add into the plan for your trip. So it kind of just goes back to what do you want your trip to be?
Got it.
Yeah,
For me, that was an important component of it. I still do speak nationally. I speak at women's motorcycle events. I speak at women in business events. I speak at schools for children. And all of that can be found on my website, too, if any of your listeners are looking for a speaker.
Absolutely. And
nice.
we'll put that in the show notes, too. We'll put your website
thank you.
on there. Yep.
Any particularly favorite or special speeches or books or articles that you've written?
One of my favorite school visits was actually the first one when I kicked off my trip, because I hadn't really been going yet with the school visits with the trip, and I didn't know the impact they would have. But before I left, let me rewind a little bit. So I had written a book called Philanthropic Wanderlust, and most of the humanitarian I work with do with children is outside of the U.S. And with being on the road for a year, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do Project Threading Hope and Highwire for that year. So I thought, okay, I need to do something that I can do in the U.S. What can I do while I'm on my trip? And so I rewrote the Philanthropic Wanderlust, which is a book for adults, into a children's version, and I donated it to schools as I traveled. So I'd go and I'd speak and help to foster humanitarianism in children in elementary school, and then provide them a classroom set of books.
Cool.
So my first visit was in a low-income school in Tucson. And of course, everything that could go wrong on that first day that you're trying to leave, my spot tracker wouldn't work,
Of course.
my bungee cord broke, which later I stopped using bungees. But everyone learns that the hard way on motorcycles. But I was starting to ride, and I left in September, so that's still pretty hot in Arizona. And so I'm riding to the school in Tucson. Gear's not perfect. I'm fiddling with everything. It's day one. I'm sweating. And I come around the corner, and I see this line of children just racing down the chain link fence that surrounds their school. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what they're playing. And then I look and I realize they're all looking and waving at me and running as I drive around the block to come into the parking lot of their school. Wow. And it was the students I was there to come speak to. And I tell you what, it took like all I had to not be teary when I was trying to take my helmet off. And I was like, look cool, Danell. Look cool. You're inspiring kids. Don't cry. So
that's amazing.
That was probably one of my favorites, only because I had no expectation at that time of the impact I could have. And a couple of those students actually there's a newspaper that children write for called Bear Essentials. And they wrote a story about me and the impact of that visit and my trip. And so it not only fostered this side of adventure, and that women can ride motorcycles, and that you can grow up and be an adventurer, whether you're a boy or a girl, and you can write. And then they took that and wrote stories about it. And that was pretty powerful to me.
Yeah. So along those lines, have there been anyone else who reached back out to you that was inspired by you, that maybe they went to one of your speeches or events, or they read your book or article, and they reached out to you and were inspired? And have you had any experiences like that?
Yes, I've had quite a few actually, and it always is super humbling. And I have a lovely young girl who still to this day, her dad sends me the pictures she draws, and she is learning to ride. And she's in Oklahoma, and I don't want to say her name just to give her that anonymity, but she's a lovely young girl, and she draws me pictures of Amelia. They're in my garage. She tells me all the time about the inspiration. I have sent her my books to her dad. Cool. Some of them, I've let him know this isn't age appropriate for about 10 more years, but I want her to have it.
Yeah, that's cool.
But this last week, so I spoke at Vintage Days at AMA, and I had a gentleman come up to me there, and he was probably in his 60s, and he said, I've been planning this trip for probably 10 years, and I just never go. And then you came here and you're speaking on this, and no offense, but if you can do it, I can do it. And I was like, you're exactly right.
Nice.
Yeah.
And he said, because you're tiny. And I was like, I know, it just happens that way. But so I have been approached by women, by men, by girls. And this last week, I actually just received, and if you don't mind, I'd love to share it with you.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it just came through my email yesterday, actually, at like 6 p.m. on my YouTube channel from a guy named Thomas Anderson. And he said, I think what you're doing is great. You told me once to go for it. So I bought my Triumph Tiger Explorer thinking of traveling. I have a paid 4-month off every year, so south I go. But watching your videos helped me to learn and prepare for. My granddaughters and my daughter don't want me to leave, and that part is hard for me. They're my life, but I know I'll come back. Thank you, young lady. You helped me with a dream I've had for years.
Yeah. Wow.
And when I get frustrated about my videos, like the Pakistan one that I've been trying to build for a year, that I'm going to finish this weekend, by the way, your podcast helped push me because I wanted to be able to tell your listeners, you can see the video on YouTube. Anytime I start to feel overwhelmed by things like that, or the commitments of putting stuff out there, the universe ends up putting these right in front of me to say, this is why you're doing it. And those messages from people just warm my heart. I mean, there's no way to put into words how those make you feel, to know that you're a part of someone chasing their dream and that you helped let them know that it's okay and they can do that. You know, I had people that did that for me, like Wade and Phillip from Australia, you know, when I met them in Peru, and I was like, oh, so we can do that. Okay, I'm doing it.
That is so awesome. Great. And when you were talking about making a date earlier, I was nodding my head because there's so many things that you could do if you just set a date. And I was nodding my head because I'm like, you're absolutely right. Like like a lot of these people that have messaged you, it's like, we'll set a date and you will go. That's so great.
And even in your daily, you know, like I've made the progress I've made on my Pakistan video because I'm a big believer in time blocking. But I'm not super tech savvy. So somebody who knows what they're doing and can build a video can probably do it a lot faster. But I have over like 20 hours into something that's going to be 11 minutes long, you know?
Yeah.
But that's okay. It eventually will come out and hopefully it will inspire some people to go to places that typically you don't visit, or you don't need to see the work that someone puts into it. It's like the overnight successes that people always talk about, you know, oh, it's an overnight success. Yeah, typically 10 years in the making of hard work that you never saw.
Right.
So I think that giving yourself those timelines, whether it's for projects you want to do, for adventures you want to be on, and even in small doses, like I'm a big financial nerd. So reading those things to get you ready for your trip. Like before I left, I was putting 12% into retirement, and I wanted to make sure that I put 25 for the 2 years before I left, which now I'm a bit of a nutcase with how much I'm putting into retirement. But that made me feel okay for taking a year off to not contribute.
Right.
For other people, they don't need that. They're okay just walking away for a year. That wasn't me. So again, going back to that know yourself, I also had a $5,000 reintegration fund to give myself some leeway to come back and find work and do different things. And I downsized before I left to be able to save all of that.
Yeah.
So
nice.
it's not that you can't go. It's a matter of, are you willing to make the choice or the sacrifice to go when you want to go and go how you want to go. So for everybody, that's different. Like I knew I couldn't save enough in 2 years to hotel it every single night. That's not something that my budget would allow for. So it's knowing yourself and knowing what you want and setting those deadlines. I mean, you set the date for the trip. And with that said, though, I will caveat, give yourself a little bit of flexibility with that. So I was going to leave on my birthday, which was 2 weeks before I left, and leaving that 2 weeks early. Staying the 2 weeks later into September gave me an extra 20% into the state retirement plan I was paying into. And I was like, I'm not going to leave 2 weeks before for 20%.
Right. Yeah.
It's not going to happen. So give yourself a little leeway, but don't give yourself too many excuses, because then you'll be years later and you still haven't gone. And I mean, the bottom line is, this time next year will still be this time next year. I'll still be turning 39, but will I be turning 39 with another project ready? And, you know, so just give yourself that leeway of knowing you're going to age no matter what. It just depends on what you want that next year to look like.
Yeah, definitely.
So any upcoming adventures that you have planned here in the future?
Yeah, I do have a pretty big one that hopefully I'll be able to call you guys back on.
Sweet. Okay.
Yeah, I learned the hard way not to talk about stuff till it's officially
there.
Because I get all excited and I share things, and then people are like, "Oh, did you do that?" And I'm like, "Nah, it fell through."
Okay. Cool.
But yeah, this fall, in terms of just mini adventures, I'll be taking a trip for Threading Hope and Highwire. I don't have the exact location yet. I'm looking at Tibet or possibly Bali. I'm in talks with a couple different humanitarian projects, so keep an eye out for that.
Yep,
that will happen before December, so that will for sure
Cool.
be happening this fall.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really loved it. It was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
So, thank you
thanks.
so much.
Yeah, I felt like I talked at the speed of light, but you guys had such great questions. I'm like, I've got to fill all this information
Awesome.
in. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll have you on. We'll have you on again another time too.
That sounds great. Thanks, guys.